All right, I told you I was going to show you how to clean up little dirt nibs in a paint. First, I got to do some touch up, so I just took the lid after shaking up the can of paint, and I've got a very small detail brush. This car, the extra damage that was done to it was a little bit just here inside the door, where I guess opening it up caught it to catch an edge. Now that I replaced the fender, you just want to go up to make sure that none of this stuff rusts on your customer. I could probably use a different silver or add a touch of silver to get this closer, but the gentleman that owns this vehicle does not care. I'm doing this just because it bothers me, not because it was by request. Okay. I'm not going to show you the clearing because it's the same as the touch-up. You just want to make sure that you get some on there to make sure that the area is protected. Now, when I go to denib, I use a razor blade. The problem with using a straight edge razor blade is the corners. The corners have a tendency to gouge. So an older paint friend of mine showed me this little trick. What it does is it just gives you a slight lift. So it kind of just makes it, I wouldn't say foolproof, but definitely helps you from gouging paint, especially fresh paint. Because fresh paint, although dry to the touch, if pressed in hard enough, you can actually fingerprint it. You can gouge it very easily until the clear fully cures. Now this paint is just 24 hours old. You need to gentleness. Now, I've got one here, I've got one here, and one here. The best way to feel them is just run your hand over it. One over there, and definitely one there. You can actually hear them as your fingers rub over them and definitely feel them. But what you're gonna wanna do is just keeping it just to the point where you're not trying to cut this way through it. You'll gouge into the clear. You want to pull it across so that it's not exactly horizontal to it's vertical. You want to have it over a little bit. And you can just literally go back and forth and turn it a little bit. What you don't want to do is work the area so bad that it literally tears off a whole bunch of clear. Now, this is also the same process I use for removing runs, but you need to give runs more time to cure or you'll literally rip the clear right off the car. They need a couple of days, if not a week, to cure up. And be very aware as you're doing this, because you are using a razor blade and you definitely don't want to go get stitches. Okay, there's one right there. And then just run your finger over it, and your finger will tell you a whole bunch about the surface that you're working on. And if this is a new technique to you, don't go right up to your prized car and start denibbing. Practice. This is not something that you just figure out the first time out. I can't tell you how many times I've re-cleared a panel when I was learning because I just figured, oh, it worked once for me. I had to get really good at this. It's okay to go slow and methodically. This is not something about speed. Although when you do get good at it, you can clean a panel pretty quick. All right. That actually feels pretty good. All right, now the next step is working with wet sandpaper. This is actually 1500 grit. I have used all the way down to wet sanding with 600 grit, but that was to get a laser flat finish on the bodywork I was doing. That was for a show car. And then you just go up step by step. You'll go 600, 800, 1000, 1200, 1500, 2000, 2500, 3000, and then the buffing process starts. And basically each level, there's a coarseness. As you go up, the coarseness, obviously, the higher the number, the less coarse sandpaper is. Which what it'll do is, each time you're using it, you're knocking down the last set of scratches on your panel. This is also the same way I restore headlights. When you're using wet sandpaper, obviously, please use it wet and change it a lot, okay? You don't want to have music playing in the background or anything like that. And the reason why is because this paper makes a certain tone. As you're going, you hear it. And if you pick up a piece of dirt, and it doesn't take much, if you pick up a piece of dirt, that's the reason why I shaved off the high pieces, because if I just went with the paper on them and started going to town on them, eventually whatever that dirt is going to break off and suddenly get stuck in your paper, and then you're going to be moving it back and forth on your panel. It's not this fine of paper. It's going to create large gouges, especially, like I said, if this is fresh paint, you will end up gouging the paint severely, and then you have to continue to wet sand down, and if it's bad enough, you end up re-clearing it. This is a very slow and methodical process. Now what I'm doing here, again, I could have gone down to like an 1100 paper. When I'm doing vehicles all over, I actually have a special DA that I use. This is actually it. It's got a paper on it and a very squishy pad. The reason I use it with the squishy pad is because if you had a flat pad, you'd be working this area and not working the inside area. So you end up having the ability to contour a little bit to the panel, which is nice. But again, there wasn't enough issues with this panel to even worry about that. All I'm really trying to do here is take down the dirt nibs and flatten the panel out. Now you notice the dirt nib was very small, but I'm working a large portion of the panel. And the reason why I'm working the large portion of the panel is because of the fact that if I just worked this one little area, you'd see it, because it would look uber flat. And then obviously it'd be easily picked up, especially under fluorescent lights. So I've just gotten into the habit of doing a much larger area. Plus, when you go to buff it, it tends to blend out better with the orange peel that just naturally occurs when clear coating. The other part you need to remember when you're wet sanding and buffing a car, you have to know how much clear was put onto the panel. Because if you go to town and you start wet sanding, wet sanding, wet sanding, wet sanding, you're going to make that layer of clear, which is your protection for your color, extremely thin. So the UV rays that come from the sun are going to go right through it, and they're either going to kill your pigment, or I've seen it where it actually goes through the clear down to the E-coat, which is a primer coat, and causes the entire area to start failing underneath. The E-coat turns to dust and actually causes, when the vehicle gets, say, a stone chip, it actually pops the paint and then it just starts flaking off. I've seen that in a lot of white cars and white work vans, where almost all the paint on the front of the vehicle up near the windshields comes off. That's because, from what I was explained, that was E-coat failure. That's why the primer coat still looked good when all the paint came off. Now, I use a little flexi block like this. Do not wrap the paper like this and start wet sanding. Always use some form of flexible block. They make stiffer ones too that will allow you to work a very long panel. The reason I like the flexible blocks is you'll see my fingers are right here and they're pushing. If I didn't have that block here to distribute the pressure outward, what would happen is you'd get a whole bunch of fingerprint sanding marks going down your panel, zigzagging. And the finer and closer you get to that perfect image, the more those things will show up in your work. So you just want to get out of the habit of not having something like this. The other nice part about having it is I use it as a squeegee. So I can see my panel as the clear comes off. And you'll see I have a little bit of an area in here that's showing up. A little bit right here that's showing up. Hopefully that's coming through on the camera, but if not, you'll have to take my word for it. So I'll work those areas a little bit more. Also, the other thing you want to take into consideration is this panel had no body work done to it. This was straight out of the package. But if you have body work, and that body work doesn't have the appropriate cure time, and you'll find this in a lot of the higher end work, when you sit here and you wet sand the car out, you'll actually see that damage area in a couple of months. It actually comes through because you've gotten the panel so flat that when it starts fully cure, I give my primer time to fully cure. And then I will go back and forth through the primer stages, giving it cure time, letting it go for a while, and then I'll get back on it. That's why I do multiple projects at a time, because when you're not doing one, there always seems like there's another one that you can play with. The other downside to wet sanding is as you do it, you start making the area that you do very flat, and the orange peely area right next to it, for somebody like me, a little OCD, that'll drive you nuts. So my areas that are quite small, removing dirt nibs, end up being a very large area to buff. And I think we're at that level now. I'll get my buffing stuff together, and we'll move on to that step. All right, I've gotten all my buffing equipment. I like using wool pads on fresh paint. I also have the foam pads for the cutting portion of this, which is a cutting compound. It's a little bit more aggressive. It's able to work out these finer scratches. I normally grab an old paintbrush, or a brand new one in this case, to clean it off. They do make it's a little metal wheel. It looks like it's got two spurs on it that you run it back and forth on this. It's to clean off the compound that actually gets firm. I have it, but it's at my house. Find the next best thing. Now again, a lot of people, when using compounds, they want to put it directly on to the car. I was told by a representative of a company that makes compounds, the problem is that initial hit, especially if you're not working that area right away and you got a nice little squiggly of compound over here, can sometimes have a reaction, because a lot of these used to be abrasive based. Now a lot of them are chemical based. They actually help warm the panel up to get a little bit of the clear to actually reflow, depending on the heat you put in, but you have to be extremely careful, especially when using a large buffer like the one I have here. I just like to work it into the pad a little bit first, and then if there's any residuals on my hand. The other reason why I use my hand, like I said with the sandpaper, is that you want to feel if there's anything on the panel that's going, like a piece of dirt, that might get into your buffing pad and literally work swirl marks into your paint, which is the last thing you want to deal with, especially after all the steps of wet sanding. And it feels pretty good. So I work it around. The reason I do this is so that when I first turn this on, it doesn't fling everywhere. And I try to aim it either at my waist so that it'll hit me or it'll hit the panel. So now as I'm doing this, I am putting almost no pressure on this panel whatsoever. The friction that's created by your pad is what does the work. If I literally got on there and pressed down hard, it would eat right into that clear. That's why I am almost supporting all the weight with this hand. They make handles for it. I've just gotten used to holding it here. Just a personal preference. Now, another thing you want to remember is if your buffer is spinning this way and you go to this edge, you're going to grab that edge, okay? If it's coming up and it's hitting it like that, it's going to grab it. And I've actually seen guys that were new to this bend sheet metal, because again, this stuff is not like the older cars where it's really thick and almost structural. These are very thin, basically aesthetically pleasing. What you're looking for here is to always take into consideration the rotation. This one, as you can see, is clockwise. So as I go to any edge, I'm going to actually turn my body so that it is rolling over that edge, not pulling up on it. You don't want it to pull up on an edge like that. You always want it to roll off the edge, like a waterfall. If you were to drop water on you, you'd see the water come off. That's the way you want this turning. So if I get here, I'm going to want to make sure that it's turning like this as I do this edge. And I'm being very careful not to work both edges at the same time. This plane, this plane. If I go like this right here on this edge, it will cook that edge. So we'll add a little bit more to the pad. All right, now, this is one thing I was told that a lot of people do. They try to make the panel look finished on the first step. You're not trying to finish out your panel with just the compound. You're just trying to take, like when you're wet sanding, you're trying to take the last sandpaper scratch off. So this level is just to take the last type of paper that you use to get rid of that scratch and flow it out a little bit more. Each time the scratch gets smaller and smaller, it gets easier to reflow. So I will move from this, on that, to this. A little firm. Now, this is going from a cutting compound to more of a polishing compound. Again, try to work it into the pad because you don't want to spray it everywhere. Okay, I feel a lot of stuff on here. That's not actually dirt. That's from this compound getting a little dry. If you do this long enough, you actually feel the difference between the two. Now, once I've gotten that level done, I want to check it. There's two ways to check it. the way I'm going to be doing, because again, I know this is a commuter car, he just didn't like the big dent in it. I will be just doing a simple wipe down and looking at my reflection in it, trying to find if I didn't get all the areas that I sanded. That being the case, and if I was doing this on a show car, I would actually use wax and grease remover on the panel, do a full wipe down of the panel. Reason why is because I want to get any of this or this that filled in to some of the scratch marks off that panel. Once it dries, I'll be able to see the areas I need to work more. So I'll get a cleanup rag and we'll go to that step. All right, I got my cleanup rag. And just like you would treat your car if you had just washed it, you just want to go over, make sure that you get all of the residual compound and anything out of the cracks, because depending on the quality of the compound, sometimes it'll leave a residue in the cracks. As you can see there, there's a little bit of dirt in there. And the other reason I do this is to get all the stuff that slings around, because even if you're careful, you still end up slinging some stuff around. And we have a completed, nice, very smooth fender now. But I think she's ready to go. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content, hit subscribe below. Throw me a like. Have a great day.